It's 7 o'clock. Welcome to another Table 13. I'm your host, a wooden leg, coming at you from the desk of Irrational Radio. We got some questions here pertaining to D&D and storytelling that I'm going to answer, and let's get right into it here. Our first question is from Daffodil. He asks, for newer DMs, would you suggest longer run campaign, or a one-shot to start off with? So, in my opinion, I think that one-shots are a great way to begin to be a DM. They allow you to learn the rules of whatever system you want. They allow you to interact with people who are role players, whether they be new or experienced. It also allows you to just kind of get into the chair of the DM, get comfortable with it. But and this is my opinion, as all these answers are, not fact at all, but I would always strive to run a long-form campaign rather than a one-shot. So I would see one-shots as a way to train yourself for the eventual long-running campaign. Because that's really where the sweet spot is of role-playing. That's where you get the most magic, is from the campaigns that are years long, and that you wind up meeting your best friend or your wife during, or husband, I don't know. They're where the magic really happens. A one-shot is fun, and I'm not saying that you can't have those kind of experiences with a series of one-shots, especially with the same group of people. But in my experience, the really important stories or the really powerful stories come from campaigns that have been running for at least 4 or 5 months, if not longer. I've had campaigns that have run into the years, so it's just how I view the difference between one shots and full length campaigns. A little bit about each one if you're not if you're very inexperienced. A one shot campaign is a campaign that you set up and tell a story within a single session, which means that you have to develop some kind of story arc that resolves in some way. And it usually has to be even more satisfactory than a long-running campaign session. A single session in a long-running campaign could be a small part of a larger arc, but a one-shot, as the name implies, is a single session. And so you have to build a compelling story arc within that single moment of time that you have. So, and then a long-running campaign is a more classic form of role-playing, where you all get together and you tell a story over many, many sessions, building up into some kind of cathartic moment at the end of the campaign. That is why I suggest that newer DMs start with a one-shot, even though they're a little harder to do with as much finesse as some long-running campaigns can be done. I think that it definitely has the better ability where it's not so much to jump on yourself all in one time. Though, this is a kind of a false dichotomy here. I think that really the best place to start are one-shots that are pre-constructed. That like one-shots that you can find online or find in some online resources that are already built as a compelling story arc to be told in a single session. That way you just have to learn the rules and learn how to describe things in a compelling way as a DM. You don't have to worry about world building. You don't have to worry about balancing issues. You just have to worry about telling a story that's already been laid out for you in a general sense. So I hope that answers your question, Daffodil. If you have further questions, just post them in chat. I will be on until the questions are over. I think that is kind of how I kind of operate this, because there's been a lot of dead air in sometimes waiting for questions or something like that. So these Q&A sessions, I guess a little bit of news before I get further into some more questions. Going forward, I'm going to alternate Q&A and lecture, where 1 week I do a lecture over a topic that I'm interested in, either that be Dungeons and Dragons related, role-playing related, or even literature, philosophy, or my many, many interests. And I will announce what the theme of the lecture will be before the stream, before the class happens. And then on the other weeks, I will be doing this classic Q&A session where I get on stream with the Discord chat up here. And if you want to join, all you have to do is join Irrational Radio's Discord. I'm sure you can find it somewhere in Twitch. I need to figure out where that is so I can like maybe point to it. I don't know, it's over like up there. I don't know. It's somewhere. You can find it if you look, especially if you have some people in our community hang out in the stream. So yeah, going forward, that is how this will be structured. So this is the first Q&A of the new era, I guess. Or no, second Q&A because I already filmed this once. But yeah, so moving on to Goose here. All right, so Goose asks, do you play with any strangers in your ongoing campaigns? And if you have you connected with them out of character to make them feel more connected to the group? Yes, I have done that quite a few times. Running a D&D server, I meet strangers all the time. If I understand your question correctly, I assume that you mean like strangers in real life, people that I don't know outside of a Discord community or outside of a role-playing campaign, or those that I may know but have never role-played with. Yeah, and I have, and all those are true. I have done those, all of those categorical things that I just mentioned. So dealing with strangers is less of like a role-playing thing and more of a life thing. Role-playing is just one of the many things that you're going to experience in life where you have to work in a group, and it's one of the few rare ones where people are like, man, I can't wait to get into a big group of people and try to do something together, because that's usually not done as much in this day and age as it was in previous. You can see my old white beard growing. But so for strangers, be friendly, especially in role-playing. Be friendly, be attentive, and seek to respect their ideas. Something that I always try to do is if there's someone new to my group, I try to get them kind of into the zeitgeist of the group in terms of like, this is please make a backstory, and you have a lot of freedom in what you do with that backstory. You can help me build the world that you're in with your backstory. And I try, whenever they have an idea, I try to strive not to say no. I try to strive to say how. This is what I want to do with this setting. This is what you want to do. How do we connect those two ideas? And some of my favorite things have come about through the connection of two wildly unrelated settings or wildly unrelated like ideas in terms of settings. I think I've mentioned one before. I wanted to run a campaign where each member of the group was part of a unique culture that worshipped a certain animal and a certain way of fighting. And it was, all the animals were rideable. They were giant animals. And one of my friends, she said that she wanted to make rideable rabbits. And I thought that was silly at first, because I wanted, I was thinking more like the classic, the rhino, the bull, the elephant, or, some maybe even like fantastical, the riding cat, anything you could find in Dungeons and Dragons. But she was like, no, I want riding rabbits. And so we talked about it for a while, and it was, because what she really meant was like battle rabbits, and what I heard was bunny rabbits, and bunny rabbits weren't going to fit in that campaign. I don't want to know what a 10-foot bunny rabbit would be trying to ride. Probably be horrible. But like, we figured out that an armored hare, like the kind you find in a savannah with the really long ears and the very slender body, at large enough scales would be rideable without doing doing. It would be a terrifying thing to fight against in a high plane. So that idea spawned an entire area of this world that was a giant-sized savannah. So you always see the characteristic jungle with the giant animals. Well, this was a plain with giant animals, so the grasses were 15 feet tall, and you could find a centipede that could take your leg off scuttling around underneath them. And there were giant field mice, and it turned into one of my favorite parts of that setting, from an idea that I thought did not fit at all. But instead of saying no, I was like, okay, well, how are we gonna make what I thought and what you want the same thing, or a way that we see the same picture in our mind and both agree that that's really freaking sweet. So that would be really the what you got to do to get strangers involved in not just your campaign, but in D&D and role-playing in general. Is, this is a place where we try to celebrate the wild and crazy ideas because, we got a sandbox of our imagination and everything is possible. So we want to find the connections between what is possible before we start, cutting off ideas from a thing that is already is infinite. So there's no reason to limit it. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question about strangers, Goose. I will be moving on. Alright. So Shady Ankle Bottoms here asks, is there any sort of process where you handle NPC to NPC interactions or other side conversations with NPCs to make them feel real? Well, one of the things that I like to say, or I don't like to say, but something that I jotted down here when trying to think of answers to these questions are, if the NPCs are the same, as in like, we all have, if you have D&D or is DM'd at all, like the characteristic rough soldier voice, hey, what are you doing over there? Get those gold coins out of your pocket. I saw you take those. If you have two guards that have the same voice and they're talking to each other, you're not going to be able to keep them apart. Your characters aren't going to be able to keep them. Your role players aren't going to be able to keep them apart either. If I'm two guards, being like, "Hey, I saw these guys take coins out of their purse. Oh, well, we better arrest those two guys. Yeah, well, let's go over there and put them in handcuffs." There's no difference between them. And for those kind of NPCs, you really don't want there to be a difference. You don't want to have a unique voice for every single player in your campaign, or every single NPC in your campaign, because you're going to A, run out of the range of vocal possibilities that you're equipped with, and B, it's a lot of work, and you sometimes will stray into the silly too far, and you lose some of the impact of the roleplay. But if the NPCs are unique and different enough, like you have a count or something that you've been building up for a few sessions, and they talk to him, and then his wife is there as well, she's maybe got a really high, proper voice, and then he's, one of my favorite count voices, will you make your lips really loose and just, hello, my dear. Well, actually, I'm talking like this, and then I talk like this. They're two very distinct characters, and if I had a conversation between them, you would be able to tell them apart immediately. I wouldn't have to preface it with a lot of he said, she said, and then the count goes, or in the count says, because they're two very distinct voices. Some of my players in a game called Paralandia will recognize Bill and Betty's voice, because it's what I did. They were a husband and wife magic duo, and Bill had a very fat voice, and Betty had a very shrill voice, and there was no mistaking them for any other character in the campaign, just because their voices were so unique. And because of that fact, I was able to have conversations between them without being confusing or annoying, or, Betty's voice was annoying, but it was character annoying rather than structurally annoying. You want to avoid structurally annoying in your campaigns. And, you want to kind of tease character annoying. Annoying characters can be great if used well, or characters with annoying qualities can be great if used well. So I hope that answers your question for NPC to NPC interactions, Shady. We'll move on to Goose's any tips for drawing battle maps. So this kind of relates to your question about lower down about Theater of the Mind, because they relate to each other very closely, because really the battle map is the only thing separating Theater of the Mind from, normal role-playing. And to just add some description of what I'm talking about here, Theater of the Mind is when you play a role-playing game of any type without a map or without character tokens, in that the combat or all the interactions take place within the theater of the mind, or the stage of the mind. Which just means that, there is no physical representations of what is happening in the role-playing game other than character sheets. Whereas the more classic form, you play with a table, character tokens, or you play online with a system like Roll20 or a whiteboard, or online whiteboard. I got started playing on a whiteboard with real people, so my battle maps were literally just squares on a hex grid. I didn't put any more effort into it. In fact, I was blown away when I first discovered that you could sell battle maps for role players, because I was like, wow, that's a incredible luxury. Of course, now I'm saying this, years later, and I've bought quite a few. But that is my suggestion would be, especially if you're getting into the hobby, don't go out and buy some crazy battle map pack with like 120 maps in it. Don't scour Pinterest for that perfect creek that you're looking for to place your role players next to. Just go into Paint and throw the pixel size up to where it fits on whatever program you're using, whether it be Roll20 or a whiteboard program, and just draw some lines. Just blue lines for rivers, brown lines for roads. It doesn't have to be beautiful, it has to be functional. You don't want to run the risk of making a map that maybe is visually interesting but impossible to use or confusing to use for your role players. You want to keep it as simple as possible, and there's nothing more simple than lines drawn on a white background. Nothing at all. You want a couple of colors, because with more colors comes more variation. You don't have to use so much symbolic variation. You can just use color. Like I said, blue lines for rivers, black lines for road, or brown lines for roads, black lines for walls. That's pretty simple, and no one is going to get confused. No one is going to be like, what is this? If you just got a square and say it's a house, everyone will look at each other and go, yes, that is a house. Those are its walls. That's where the house begins and ends. But you don't want a battle map where it's confusing where those things are. I have seen some battle maps online, or some people that have pulled just pictures offline or maps offline and then blown them up to a size where they're battle map worthy. And those get confusing because the walls are so stylized that it's difficult to tell them between the walls and the ceilings, or the walls and the floors, or one wall and another, or one room and another room. And we want to keep it simple. So my suggestion would be, especially if you're starting out, just get good at drawing lines on a white background. And then if you want to spend some money on your hobby, I would suggest supporting artists that draw battle maps, because they do put a lot of effort and a lot of time into creating those works of art for you to use, and it's great when you support artists. I highly recommend it, especially for something like this where there isn't necessarily like the Coke of battle maps. There are, especially in this day and age where role playing is becoming much more popular. It's kind of like a rising wave of people that are interested in the hobby. But in this kind of scenario, you want to support the individuals who make this hobby interesting, and who and that's also why you should buy the books. I know there are many resources to download them for free, but people spend a lot of time working on those things, and while it's not necessarily like morally wrong to download it offline, you're definitely not supporting the artist monetarily that way. And an artist that isn't supported monetarily isn't going to be able to continue making art in the capacity they would be able to if they were paid. So if you like the battle map, if you like the artist, buy the stuff. Don't just take it. So that's some battle map suggestions. If you want any more, just throw it up on the chat. I'm here till the questions go away. All right. So Goose asks, it's kind of an inside thing, so I'll make some descriptions of it. But Goose asks, please share the detail you put into Startup Glod and how you get the players to stay invested in just one city. So for a little background information, Startup Glod is one of my settings that I use for campaigns. It is a single city located underground on a planet that can't support life on its surface, and this is possibly the only city on that planet in a universe that has been eaten by, we'll just say, a really big bad evil. So they're hurtling through this planet. They don't even have a solar system anymore. The sun was eaten, and they're all in this city, and it's all fantasy races. It was an ancient dwarven city built by immortal dwarves, but when Death was released and this big bad evil ate the universe, the immortal races became mortal. So this became a refugee city for anyone who could escape the big bad evil. One of the immortal dragons from the time of dragons was there to shield the city from the big bad evil that was enveloping the rest of the universe, and the planet was left perhaps alone in the material plane, just hurtling through blackness. So Goose asks how you invest players to stay in one city. Stottomglad is a little extreme because anywhere outside of the city is probably death. There are the old roads that exist outside of the dwarven city that the immortal dwarves used to use as highways between the other cities that are now dead or lost. And those old roads are filled with a bunch of monstrosities that also survived the big bad evil and are now creeping through the dark tunnels outside of Stottomglad. So I created a situation where the city was the only safe place for the role players, and anywhere outside the city was much harsher and much more difficult to survive. In addition, the guards and powers that be in Stottomglad were overwhelmingly more powerful than the role players. In fact, this led to some problems on my end of properly showing balance between in the D&D 5e system. Stottomglad was originally made for another system, but that's a completely off topic. So if you make guard presence and the powers that be overwhelmingly more powerful than the role players, any shenanigans is immediately either stamped out by the guards through, Big Brother type magical deals, or done with an extreme caution by the role players because they understand how serious that these guards or these secret agents that exist in the city are. But those are all cheating. Every single one of those things depends on setting, and I built it with the very purpose to keep them in the city. But you don't want to do that because it's obvious, when you build a setting like that, it's a big red neon sign saying "Stay in the city, dum-dums." You don't want them to leave, because if they did, you would kill them, and you make that very clear. Or if they do leave, they're going to be in grave danger. They left a few times and I didn't kill them, but I'm much more interested in story than a TPK. But it definitely served to keep the role players more contained within a city and more interested in the things that were in the city. The thing that isn't cheating about Stottomglad that also kept them in the city was the world building that it put into the power structure. I have built entire companies with the CEO and all the little people below the CEO existing as a giant power structure pyramid, and there's a few of them. I have government structures written out, I have law books written out, all to make the city in-depth enough and interesting enough to keep role players there. Because, the call of long, dark tunnels is the call of the dungeon, and we all love a good dungeon crawl. But you need, some place to return to after the dungeon. So I strove to make Stottomglad interesting as a home base between the dungeons of the old roads. But again, Stottomglad was purpose-built for a single city. In the Paralandi campaign, they stayed in a little nothing town called Sweet Valley for 5 or 6 sessions. And that was, almost 2 months of real time. I think it was a little more because halfway through in that city, we were playing every other week until we switched to every week. And they stayed in that city for so many sessions because of a couple of reasons. First, they wanted something from the blacksmith in the city that would require them to stay in the city for an entire week for the blacksmith to complete that. Now, what I could have done is I could have gone, okay, so what do you guys want to do for a week? And then they were like, oh, I'm going to train swordsmanship, or I'm going to just hang out in the inn. And I'd be like, okay, well, that's what you did. Week's over. Now here's your thing. But instead, I made them, each session was a day. They ended up leaving early for other reasons, but each session was a day. And each day was full of role-playing, and each session was full of role-playing. And that's really how you keep role players in a location for a long period of time. There is no other way that isn't overt DM railroading You must get your players invested in their characters enough where they get lost in role playing, and all you are as a DM is a voyeur listening in to two people pretend to be two other people having a conversation. That's my favorite thing to do as a DM is let the characters role play and just sit back and let them talk. I mean that's one of it's in the name of it's role playing. And you want them to get to that point. That's the gold standard. When you have a session where all they did was, leave a tavern, go to an underground fight ring, and then have a couple drinks. That was an entire session. But because it was so full of role playing, it took 3 hours, and many, many, many interesting, intricate things happened in those 3 hours in terms of character development, how they interacted with NPCs that were also role played at them, and just like their reactions to the little things that I did in the world to react to what they were doing. If their characters got heated, I said as the narrator that a few people from other tables look over. Or if someone is being, said something that may cause a stir in this location, have that stir happen. But don't introduce the DM's heavy-handed railroad conductor hat until they start to play themselves out, or until they get to the point where they're no longer role-playing and instead just talking about the campaign or planning outside of character. You want to keep that very low to a minimum as well, because that's going to eat up much of your role-play time as well as your just story time. No story gets told when they're talking out of character, trying to come up with a plan. Try to get them to make plans in character, because then they are role-playing, then they are playing the game. Planning outside of character isn't quite as useful to you as a DM as them playing inside of character. Alright, so I hope that answered your question there, Goose. I got a few more things to say about City, but I think I might save that for a lecture. You kind of sparked a little lecture idea of like cities and time that I might write up, so stay tuned for that in the future. So we're going to go on to how do you determine, Shady's question here, how do you determine the random events that occur in your games? Is it all straight off the dome, or do you pair a resource for it? And what I assume what he means here by resource is a random number generation, or a table that relies on random number generation. Roll a D100 and the number it lands on is a thing that happens. I majorly dislike doing that. I do not like tables because they take my agency as a DM away. I like being able to control the events in my story. Sometimes I'll use those random generation table lists to like pick something that happens from them, but very rarely do I actually roll a dice to see what happens. That removes my agency as a DM, and it reduces my ability to tell a compelling story, because arbitrary randomness is not something that the universe does, in my philosophical opinion. And as a DM, you are trying to roleplay a universe, you're trying to emulate a universe, so you have to keep the things that happen in some kind of logical, coherent order. There has to be a reason for things happening. And while you can roll on a table and then build a backstory to it, it seems to me like more work. I would rather just think of something off the top of my head and then connect it, rather than have a dice bubble up something to the surface, then try to connect it. Because if you don't like what it lands on, you roll again. What's the perp? Just pick one. Just pick the one you're thinking of, and don't pray that the dice lands on it. You're a DM. And also I wanted to talk about too. There's difference between events and causes in my mind. A cause is something that the role players brought about because of their decisions either earlier in the session or earlier in the campaign. It is something that is to be planned because it had a cause. It's still an effect, but I like to call it a cause because its root is something that they did. It was caused by the role players. An event, in my mind, is something that happens regardless of the role player's actions. It can be like something big like a war or a disease outbreak, or it can be something small like, the milkmaid didn't get paid for Mr. Johnson that day. There are things that you have the ability to add like spice to the campaign or the session. There are things that you want to look for openings to put in to make it more compelling, rather than arbitrary events. I don't like arbitrary events because they again, I'll repeat this till I'm blue in the face, but they remove your agency as a DM. So I do not prepare a resource for it. The events are off the top of my head. They are just what would fit here, and they can be as something as simple as a rainstorm. And its only purpose is to slow down the pace of the campaign, so it's not easy breezy lemon squeezy, but it's not something that was caused by what the role players are trying to do. But causes, I always try to plan ahead of time, and I try to plan ahead of time by the role players do action A, and then I put a little marker about the action in my head going, ooh, that's interesting. I think I'm going to save that. I'm going to write it down, and then I'm going to plan over the next few sessions something that'll happen because they chose that, or because they did that. Something is going to happen. And those are things that I build because they give the agency, the role players, the feeling that I'm like on their side, or that I'm listening to them. They're not being railroaded. This story is told by them, and it's because of the things that they have chosen to happen. And so I try to cultivate those while peppering some of the sessions that I might not have planned with events, like random events that I think up while the session is going along. I try not to plan events that aren't connected to the role players any, unless it's very early in the campaign and I'm trying to give them a reason for being adventurers. So that I hope that answers your question there, Shady. Again, if you want any clarification, just throw it up on the chat. Going to move on to Goose. Alright, so Goose asked, Theater of the Mind, have you ever run a game with it? If you have, any tips to get the character more involved so they get a sense of the scenery? What kind of verbiage should be used, and how much describing should be done before the characters have a look around? So, Theater of the Mind, again, like I said, is the role-playing done without a board. The role-playing done without some kind of map laid out. And while I have done it before, I prefer having tokens, especially for combat, and I like having a map up when combat is not happening, so that the role players can really get a sense of where they are in space. But I do enjoy Theater of the Mind in that it is the original storytelling. When we started telling stories as a species, we were around a campfire. We didn't have battle maps, we didn't have whiteboards. We were just laying a scene with our voices and the descriptions that we used with them. So, really, if you can succeed at Theater of the Mind, you should be able to succeed at DMing or just storytelling in general, because that's what it is. It's pure form storytelling with some people mixed in. And I really think that it's something that everyone should try. Combat with Theater of the Mind, depending on the system, can get a little bit hairy. Just because if you have a system that's very dependent on range, or like flanking, or it's like state-based effects that come into being because someone is X distance, or someone is surrounded. Because those kind of systems are really dependent on battle boards to make their combat run smoothly. Because otherwise, you get a lot of who's around, what's going on, do I have flanking, do I not have flanking, and you can be accused of being an arbitrary DM if you run too much combat with those kind of systems in Theater of the Mind. And a battle map just makes it very clear. There are none of those clarification questions. So, if you were to run a Theater of the Mind campaign, I would try to stay away from the systems like 5e that are really dependent upon battle maps to run combat, unless you're not doing a combat style one shot or a campaign. And then I would not use 5e, just because if you're not using combat, you've lost most of the purpose of the 5e system and should move on to a different system like Monster of the Week or Call of Cthulhu or something like that, where it's a little bit more theater of the mind-esque. Combat is, did you hit him, did you not, decided on a d6. So it's much easier to get your role players into the setting. Now, that being said, the what kind of verbiage should be used and how much describing should be done before characters have a chance to look around, that is really a deep story question. How much should an author describe before moving the story forward? If your characters are in a room that you're never going to see again, is it really worth describing the room for 4 pages? No, it's not. No English teacher will tell you to do that if they're worth their salt. You want to keep descriptions as tools, not as page filler or not as the sole purpose of writing. Descriptions are there to as a scaffold for the story. They're what make the story interesting and keep the story up. You can tell a story without any description, but it's very, very, very boring. It's a logic problem at that point. A did B, and then C happened. No one wants to hear that story. But description makes it much more interesting, but too much description makes it impossible to follow. If I spent an hour describing what A was and all the facets of A, and then I got to B, most of you wouldn't have survived that long. You would have stopped 10 minutes into me describing what A was. And then no one would be there for me to finally describe C and why those things are together. There are some benefits to that in-depth of world building or that in-depth of description, but they don't belong within the story itself. They belong as resource or as auxiliary pieces to the story at hand. You really don't want to get into those kinds of depths until you have a story under your belt, until you have characters that are well defined, not just in description but in spirit and within roleplay. So you gotta. It's not a right or wrong answer to the how much description should you give. Not too much, not too little. You don't want to do A, then B, so C, but you also don't want to describe the oak tree for an hour because they're not going to listen. Half of them are going to get on Facebook within 5 minutes of a description. And you slow the pace down of the story a lot with description because nothing happens in description. Though, that being said, there are multiple kinds of descriptions, and I could do an entire lecture on description if that's something people would be interested in. But a quick rundown, there are descriptions of things, and then there are descriptions of action. Descriptions of things can be broken down into objects and places where, you describe the desk or the car, but it's not doing anything. The car is blue, it's very sleek, it has 4 seats, leather interior, new wheels, very clean headlights, and it goes super fast. But those aren't descriptions of what the car is doing. They're descriptions of the object itself. If I said, the car is being crushed under the heel of a Tarrasque, that is what is going on. And I can say the car is blue and the Tarrasque is ugly, but it slows down the action. I can describe the depth of the blue, I can describe the newness of the wheels, and I can describe the headlights all I want to, but the Tarrasque is still going to crush it. And if I spend too long describing how this Tarrasque crushes the car, I'm not going to have any time to describe what else the Tarrasque might be doing. So you want to find a middle ground. It's all about balance. But, I don't have any magical formula for how you find that balance. It is just something you do with you succeed in by practicing, and something that gets better as you do it more. So I hope that answers that question for you. I'm sorry you guys can't see the questions. I have yet to figure out how to make this so that I can get all of them, because the screen's too small. I can get all the top on this setup, but I can't get all the bottom. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Austin's question here. Actually, if I deleted some questions, you guys would see them. I figured it out. Oh, look at me. Oh, that's why they pay me the big bucks. All right. Nope, one more. One more. There we go. Alright, so Austin asked the last question here. How would you go about keeping political intrigue in the mind of your players? Like, would putting them in the thick of the politics or have it as a background thing that only seldom comes up? Well, so political intrigue is something that always should exist in the role-playing setting, as long as there is politics in the role-playing setting. You know, if you're playing the blasted hellscape of yesteryear, you're not going to have very many bureaucrats running around, you know, throwing red tape on things. Everyone's dead, and it's just survival of the fittest at that point. But if you're playing, you know, like the, you know, long-lived kingdom of some, you know, line of kings that has been, you know, ruling since before the days of yore, you're going to have an intense political atmosphere with lots of nobles, lots of counts and dukes all vying for power, all to either appease the family of the king or overthrow them, or, you know, discredit them, or even bring themselves more power at the expense of their liege while they still enjoy them. Those are, you know, that's going to happen when you have a large group of people. So how would you go about keeping political intrigue in the mind of your players? I would suggest not throwing them in the thick of it just as a campaign, unless your role players are really into that. I would suggest trying to get them interested in it from the outside by making it a big deal in your setting. You know, something like Rome was where, you know, every time the Senate met, there could be big decisions that caused massive ramifications for everyone in that city. So if you were to, you know, be or role-playing a group of people that weren't in the nobility but were still affected by the decisions of the nobility, they might get really interested in it, especially if it affects them in like a third-person, impersonal kind of way. You know, I have, you know, you can do something like, suddenly the laws of the realm changed because some noble got in with the king and convinced him that it was a good idea. And those rule changes immensely affect what the players are trying to do. And in that sense, they will get involved in politics. They want to keep their leverage, or they want to keep their special MacGuffin that has now become illegal. So that is how to involve them in political intrigue without, you know, forcing them into it. Make it have an effect on them, but impersonally. Don't make it that the noble that they'd insulted is trying to, you know, get back at them. Make it so that they're just another drop in the ocean that gets, you know, tumbled by these people making these powerful decisions. Because then they'll try to figure out a way into politics. Because if it's some noble they've already insulted and is trying to get back at them, they're already in the thick of politics, and you force them into that by making the noble that powerful. Not to say they can't meet one of the nobles that they've pissed off while they're climbing, but you shouldn't make it quite so A to B. You should make it a more effect that the role players can either ignore, that will still make their life harder, or try to solve in some way. And then how to get them into the intrigue? Make them do like what we do here in the real world, you know? Make them campaign, or make them schmooze the right people. Build a story of that is, you know, like a climb to power, because that can be a campaign in itself. And if you're having trouble trying to find a long form reason for your role players to keep role playing or to stay together as a group, law changes are very useful for that, especially if it's a law change that, you know, affects them, but like I said, impersonally, so that they have to fight the system rather than just one person. So I hope that answered your question there, Austin. That is all our questions for Table 13. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these here, and then wish you guys all a good night. So again, this was the Q&A part of Table 13. Next week will be a lecture. I will announce that lecture probably over the weekend, Saturday or Sunday. And then we will meet again on Monday. So I will see you then, and stay cool, everybody.